Great, thanks. Apologies in advance if I say anything stupid. It's about 1:30 in the morning here, so I'm a little frazzled, but we'll try my best. Yeah, so the talk is trying to understand if there is a way in which we can describe and characterize phenomenology, and then develop a formal framework for that using category theory. So to start off with, I'll give some of the philosophical background, although Majid's already done some of my work for me. So you imagine a subject who's experiencing something. In the traditional cases, they have some experience of red. An intrinsic take on what it is to have phenomenal experiences or to have qualia is that the experiences themselves aren't reliant on anything else. To experience red is somehow just to have the experience of red, of a red character, and it doesn't need to be related to anything. It's not extrinsic in any way. It's just intrinsically red. Another approach, though, is to consider experiences in terms of their relational properties, and that somehow what it is to experience red is to experience something that is related to other colors like green or blue or pink, and perhaps it's something that is very similar to, but not exactly the same as pink, but that's actually very different from green. And this take on experience and qualia is known as phenomenal holism. And essentially what I'm presenting here is some way of trying to find a mathematical formalization for this and to try and find some empirical data that touches upon that sort of notion. So to start with the framework, so imagine you have some subject and they're looking out on the visual world and they have some experience of that visual world. And we can divide their visual world up into the experience of the left-hand side and the experience of the right-hand side. And let's say we consider as a category a series of like patches of their experience on the left-hand side. So maybe these two different patches of sky, which may or may not be the same, generate the same experience of blue or be the same experience of blue. In this category of these patches, we can consider as objects the actual patches themselves, and as a morphism or a connection or a relationship between these patches, perhaps a notion of similarity, but other sort of morphisms you could possibly be considered as well. We can do the same thing for patches in other parts of the visual field. So these category of land patches. And we could consider whether the relationships between patches in one category, so in the sky patches, are in some sense the same as the relationships between the patches in this land area. And if we can find some way of describing a connection between those relationships, then that's called a functor in category theory. And we can do this for different patches and different categories of patches across the visual field, potentially, maybe on the right-hand side of the visual field as well, or the experience of the visual field. And we can find other functors, and potentially we can find some sort of natural transformation, or some sort of arrow between the functors themselves. Some way of saying that the relationships between colors on the left-hand side can be related to the relationship between colors on the right-hand side. Why we're interested in using this kind of framework is we want to make use of a property in category theory called the Yoneda lemma. And I'll motivate that a little bit more. So imagine we have these two different patches, these A and B patches, and we want to know whether the experience of that patch is the same color experience or not. One thing we could consider is the relationship between each of those colors in those patches with all of the other color experiences that could be had in that patch or in that category of patches. The relationship between those patches. And what we might notice is that the relationships may or may not be the same between A and all the other patches and B and all the patches. But if it turns out that there is there is a natural equivalence between those two. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember my terminology. If there's a natural equivalence between the two, so there's an invertible natural transformation between those two, then that implies that the patches themselves are equivalent up to isomorphism. So what it means is that A and B have exactly the same relationship with all of the other patches. And the argument would be that if you're using this framework to describe phenomenal holism, that might be equivalent to saying that these colors are in fact the same color, that A and B are the same color, and in some fundamental sense are the same. So that's the approach we're trying to take. And I'll give an empirical example of why this approach can be useful. So there's a dispute in neuroscience and psychophysics about whether or not color experiences are indeed the same across the visual field. So the naive view would be that you look out upon the world and there's objects out in the world, stimuli, light bounces off them into your eyes and generates a color experience across the visual field. And then you're able to describe that to other people behaviorally. The issue that neuroscientists sometimes take is that the physiology of the eye is very much not homogeneous across different eccentricity. So you have far fewer photoreceptors in the periphery compared to the center of vision. And this results in all sorts of behavioral differences. So you have lower acuity in the periphery. You have effects like crowding, where you're unable to distinguish objects as well in the periphery. And stimuli need to have much higher contrast in peripheral vision compared to central vision for you to be able to detect them. So this leads some people to say that, like, well, we're actually mistaken when we think we have color experiences in peripheral vision, and we don't really have the same sort of experiences in peripheral vision that we do in central vision. Some people say, no, we do have color experiences across our visual field, and it's just that maybe they're not as vertical in the periphery. And there's other positions that it's possible to take as well. But we wanted to see if we could find a way of getting at this. So one way of doing this, as I've alluded to previously, is to try and capture similarity relationships between color experiences in different parts of the visual field. So that involves some experiment where you show people color patches, they generate color experiences, and you ask them to report those color experience relationships. And if you do this systematically, you get a set of dissimilarity relationships, and you might end up describing the color red, again, as something that's identical to another color experience of red, very similar to an experience of pink, or very different from an experience of green. Now, previously, people had done this for color experiences in central vision, but we weren't aware of any work that had done it for comparing color experiences in central vision to peripheral vision, or peripheral vision to peripheral vision. So that's what we set out to do for this study. And the way in which we did it was we used an online experimental method. So if you want to have a sense of what it was like for the participants, if you take your arm and you press your thumb to the center of the screen, your screen should be roughly set up in the same way that the participants saw. You don't have to keep your thumb there once you've done it. So if you're set up in that way, you will be able to see that the patches that we showed to participants in the center of vision were at about 1 degree of visual angle, so still well within the center of vision, whereas the patches that we put in the periphery were at 10 degrees, which is not super far into the periphery, but is already well outside the fovea. Any particular trial would involve showing 2 color patches either in the center of vision or in the center and periphery, or both color patches in the periphery, as you can see here. So to give an example of an actual trial, we'd put up a fixation cross to get people to look in the center. We'd show very briefly 2 stimuli so that people couldn't move their eyes and they just saw the patches where they were, and presumably it generated color experiences in their head at that location in the visual field. And then we'd ask them to report how similar those colors were between 0 and 7. And in terms of the data that we actually collected, it may come as no surprise that the similarity relationships seem to be the same in central to central comparisons, central to peripheral comparisons, and peripheral to peripheral comparisons, quite consistently across all of the subjects that we tested. So this had extremely high correlation between all these different kinds of comparisons. And if you do a multi-dimensional scaling representation of this dissimilarity data, you can see that the representations for the particular colors in central vision and peripheral vision are overlapping, suggesting that the relationships between these similarities, relationships between these color experiences are pretty much the same, and arguing for the equivalence across the visual field idea. But that's not enough to really finish off what all of the things that we would like to get at. So the first and obvious problem is the question of whether this isomorphism is enough, and because it's not the same as actual equality or identity between the colors. So the issue comes from the fact that, again, in an intrinsic sense, people refer to qualia as intrinsic, or they don't require relational properties to be described. Red is just intrinsically red, even if you couldn't experience any other possible experiences. And that when we use these similarity relationships, we're really just using them as labels between different experiences. And there's no reason why these labels should be bound to any particular experience. And perhaps they could be shuffled around. Now, this is like interesting, but I think it implies some things that I find particularly strange. So the implications of this are, you can imagine that in central vision, somebody has the standard set of color experiences and the standard relationships between these experiences. While in peripheral vision, someone may still have the same color experiences. It might be possible for them to have the same color experiences because they're intrinsic and they're just triggered by the objects that they see in their visual field. But because they're intrinsic, because they're not defined by their relationships, it's possible that their relationships could be completely different, and they might have a different set of similarity relationships in peripheral vision as opposed to in central vision, which means that, for example, here, red is now very dissimilar from pink and is in fact more similar to blue than it is to pink, which to me seems absurd. And to give another sort of example of this, this insufficiency of just the relationships implies the possibility of two different kinds of inversion. So you can imagine, to begin with, you have some normal subject who looks at the world and has normal color experiences with normal color relationships, and some invert subject that looks at the world and has normal relationships between their color experiences, but the actual colors that are experiences that are generated by the world are inverted with respect to the first person. Now, whether you take an intrinsic perspective or a holistic perspective on experiences, these are possible under both views. However, you can imagine a different scenario where you have a subject that has normal color experiences and normal triggers of normal relationships between those experiences, in contrast to this time an invert that has normal color experiences compared to this first person. So the same objects in the world still trigger the same color experiences, but again, the relationships are completely different for this particular person. And again, this isn't a knockdown mathematical proof against this point of view, but it does seem very, very bizarre to imagine someone having the same color experiences, but a completely different set of color relationships. So according to a holistic view, this kind of problem, at least, is not possible, while it is under an intrinsic view. The problem, though, with taking a holistic view in this sense is that there is some risk that it seems to imply support for eliminativism or illusionism. So if the intrinsic nature of experiences—
Just real quick, so you have 2 minutes left.
Sorry, this is the last slide, so I'll power through. If intrinsicality is not required, why not just dispense with talking about qualia and talk about subjective similarity reports instead? To which I don't have a solid response as of yet, but you should come talk to me or ask questions about this now if you're interested. And just lastly, I'd like to thank everyone who's worked with me and made this possible. Thank you.